Great. And so what we're looking at with relational cultural theory is why it's so important to us now after the experiences of the last few years. We've had a lot of really great conversations preparing for this presentation. So we said, I wish we had recorded them. Um, but I think some of what we've experienced is our own growth fostering relationship and opportunity to connect and to work through some of these things in a way to grow as ourselves as we prepare for this presentation. So hopefully we embody some of that as we present today. Spacebar. So I'm going to give an overview of RCT, some of the major tenets. So you're familiar with these for any of our people that are joining us virtually. Relational cultural theory really grew out of the writing of Jean Baker Miller, her 1976 book, Towards a New Psychology for Women, right? So she wrote that at a time when most of our counseling theories were male dominated, right? The idea of independence, striving towards independence as a hallmark of growth was seen. And so she, with Irene Shriver, Janet Surrey, and Judith Jordan, began to have sit-down conversations. I think it was twice a month. They sat down, they talked about these things. They were all practicing psychology and noticed something that was missing in the counseling theories and something that they really wanted to provide, which is that connection and that collective growth. We see this described typically as a feminist theory with strong multicultural connections, but looking at how the value is on the individual and the strength of the relationship is a really important aspect. And so looking at individuals within the context of their relationship, which for me, once we step back and look at this through a counseling lens, is so intuitive since we are in relationship, we grow through those relationships. So the theory looks at both personal and clinical relationships. But in order to understand the individual, you have to understand them within the context of their culture. So they put culture right in the middle of the theory because we aren't individuals that are independent of our cultural experiences. They also look at internalized pain, so at a micro and macro level, and how that affects an individual's ability to connect. Relational images is something that the theory talks about. We have a history of relationships and ways of connecting that influence and affect the way that we connect now. Those can be affected by marginalization, discrimination, other personal experiences, but those are so important in understanding and the ability to connect, and without looking at a person's past from almost a psychoanalytic component and looking at those relational images and relational expectations, then we can't really move forward in a way that is an authentic connection. So these are some of the principles that are frequently talked about with relational cultural theory, right? Growth is ongoing. And so we have a lifelong potential for continuing to grow. Maturity is demonstrated by mutuality. I'll talk about mutuality a little bit more, and engagement with others, not independence, right? So the American notion of once you've achieved the space in the corner office and you're standing on your pedestal that you've made it, that's growth, is really different from the way this theory looks at people as growing through relationships. So more complex and more diverse relationships demonstrate growth, right? Growth fostering relationships, a couple more slides on this, is really at the center of RCT. So looking at those being founded on mutual empathy and empowerment. Okay. So the growth fostering relationship is the source of growth and working through things both clinically and then also outside of clinical settings. So both people are affected and grow. And I love that aspect of RCT is that the counselor is not in the room, it's the word unscathed and probably shouldn't, but it's a mutual impact, right? The therapeutic alliance is built on a unique kind of mutuality. So we'll talk about that mutuality on the next slide. Mutual empathy is a tool for change, and then authenticity and honest engagement are essential for mutual empathy to grow. Okay, so this graph looks at growth fostering relationship and what it takes to build growth fostering relationship. So mutuality in this theory is usually talked about being composed of two things: that mutual empathy, which we also see described as two-way empathy. We were talking about two-way empathy recently, and the description I used, which I think works for my understanding, is I have a son, right? And little, he's 4, and he hurts himself. And I always try and go with empathy first. And so, I'm so sorry you got hurt. And he started saying, don't say that. Don't say you're sorry. I'm like, ooh, something's missing from this. And I think I'm doing good because I don't say, well, when you stand on a chair, you can expect to get hurt. So I'm being empathetic. But what I've learned is that when I say, I'm so sorry you got hurt, I'm really hurt when that happens to you, right? That's that two-way empathy. He knows that I've been affected, and I'm not just putting empathy out there. And that he will listen. That's great. Like, we're hurt together. And being able to express that with clients is what we see as a deeper level of empathy. Mutual empowerment as well. So a sense of strength that fortifies both individuals in the relationship. It's that idea of being empowered. We talk about kind of what that looks like with the 5 good things. And then authenticity, right? So that genuine care and understanding for the client, being able to express oneself fully. So honest and truthfulness in a relationship. And these are the things that we look at both clinically, but also in our personal lives. Growth fostering relationships are something that we strive to experience and have our clients experience. And sometimes I think it feels a little bit like a love bubble, but being able to explain it, that it's different from when you first are really excited to be around somebody and have that connection, but it's an ongoing sustainable relationship that both people are benefiting from and growing through. Questions? Any questions? Things that are unclear? Okay. So 5 good things, the byproduct of RCT, right? Zest, increased energy, a sense of worth, clarity of self and others, increased productivity, and a desire for deeper connection. I think that desire for deeper connection is something that we talk about a little bit more in this presentation, but when you're in a growth fostering relationship, the embodiment of these things, that mutuality, that authenticity, then there's this excitement and energy. And we probably all walked away from conversations or time where we've spent with other people where we're like, man, I can do it. I can get all these things done. I can conquer the world. I want to do more of this. Like, this is amazing, versus relationships that we walk away feeling drained, maybe disempowered, and looking at how that is different, excuse me, from a growth fostering relationship. So, right, just an image that the growth fostering relationship is the source of these things. All right, disconnection and isolation, and this will kind of lead us into our next section that Christy's going to talk about. RCT does not pretend that everything is growth fostering relationship and developmental growth, and we're just growing through connection. They look at disconnections as a source of growth, right? So looking at isolation, we talked about with this theory, the desire to connect with others. Isolation isn't a source of strength. It restrains the individual and maintains oppression, right? We can be really safe if we're isolated, but safety doesn't denote growth. So growth isn't happening. Condemned isolation is something that this theory talks about. It's the experience of feeling completely alone, excluded, and prevented from being connections. So that can be caused by history of relational disconnections, power differentials, gender roles, racism, oppression, health disparities, heterosexism, other social injustices. So looking at that as being a very more severe type of isolation to work through. Central relational paradox is something I always like to talk about, because we know that we grow through connection, but a lot of times our desire for safety causes this paradoxical retreat. I often think about the times in my own life where I say, like, I just need to be left alone for a weekend, right? And oftentimes those are the times when I need people the most, but put walls up in order to protect myself, but also prevents growth from happening. I just love that the way that this theory talks about that paradoxical experience that usually we don't give voice to. And then disconnections, right? They're a source of growth. It's growing through disconnections that we can continue to grow. Growth fostering relationships are not conflict free. They are mutually respectful. So you can have different beliefs, different ideologies even, but be able to share and grow with one another. because of that mutual respect and that mutual empowerment. Questions? All right, so then Christy is going to talk to us a little bit.
You just turn it, because I've got one in front of me too, but I would need you to advance this on.
I can do that as well.
So if you'll just hit enter points, there you go, the picture will pop up. And so we've heard the 5 good things, this and disconnection and isolation. And when I think about disconnection and isolation in response to our recent events, what we have all as a world have been through, I think of the double pandemic we've lived through in 2020, and we're still feeling the effects of in 2021. One of the 5 good things is clarity of self. And I feel like there's an importance of knowing thyself, of connecting, being able to connect with yourself before you have the ability to fully connect with someone else. And that's something that we'll talk about more later on with Zach. So looking at the double pandemic, I just want to invite people who are watching the video or on Zoom, or our members that are in person here today, to just go on a journey, because I'm going to take you and then invite you on my journey. But every individual is different. Every journey experience during 2020 is different. So just plug yourself in as you hear my journey and connect in that way. So 2020, and you can advance the slide. Thank you. The next slide will show, from my experience, the first thing that hit me in 2020 was in February. Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia was shot down. And we didn't hear about that until a full month later. The reason why this particular event impacted me so heavily was because it happened in my home state. And I never thought that something like that could happen in my home state, especially when the video was released and I watched it. It was something that I felt like shouldn't be occurring in our world today, but it is. It's unfortunate, and it is. And so we need to pay attention to that. Well, then on March the 3rd, I'm from Cookeville, Tennessee, and we had an F4 tornado that swept through 175 miles from Nashville through Cookeville, killing 18. And so a lot of those people, we knew it. Cookeville is a tight community, and so we knew people who were related. The stories were highly impactful to us, and the devastation was great. With that, as a clinician, we expect to be able to meet the people where they are, to do trauma response, and to move in and help our community. And we tried to do that. Then a week later, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic and quarantine was initiated. So all of the people who had gone through that trauma, who were in a state of mourning, the people that sure I have time to go into that, but to describe where we were in that week, we immediately responded with trauma at the food pantries there in Cookeville. Our hospital turned into a triage unit. Kids were, like young kids wearing diapers, were walking down the street and they didn't know where their families were, and were being, taken to the hospital to reconnect, to be provided clothing, things like that. I mean, this was a very impactful thing for our small community. And immediately after that, everybody was told to isolate and to disconnect. And so there was not an opportunity to work through and process that trauma in a connected way. So that's where we were. COVID was, you can advance. COVID was not as up on our radar in Cookeville as the tornado. The rest of the world, they were able to respond to what was happening with this thing called COVID-19, the isolation, the masks, the where's the vaccine, what's going on with it. There was so much misinformation because the CDC just didn't know what to report. We were still focused on the tornado trauma. And then we started seeing people that we love going into ICU and losing their lives. So the next slide shows 4 of the people that I knew personally that we lost to COVID-19. First picture, George Ray. Second picture, Jim Copeland. Third picture, Betty Hunter. And then immediately after her son, David Hunter, he was 53. And the youngest of those that I knew that passed from COVID-19. So with that being said, we were dealing with 2 different types of stressors. We were dealing with long-term stressors and short-term stressors. Short-term stressors we define as anything that occurs immediately, and then there's a stabilization that happens afterward, such as a tornado, a natural disaster, the terrorist attacks on 9/11. They were impactful, they were hard, but then there was a process of stabilization afterwards. With COVID-19, we didn't get that. We didn't receive that stabilization because there was a fear of mortality that came with COVID-19. There was an uncertainty of where this was all going. Next week, would I get COVID-19? Would I be in ICU with my child, with my spouse? So there were a lot of unanswered questions with COVID-19, and that plugs into looking at those external stressors and how they affect those relationship connections. And the chart that you see there, we talked about a double pandemic, or I talked about a double pandemic at the beginning of where I started, and that falls more into the pre-existing contextual vulnerabilities of social class, marginalized group, and the life stage and age parts, or I can't think of the word, but those classes, those groups. COVID-19 really attacked those external stressors. And then you see the adaptive dyadic relationship processes where people connect through support, affection, warmth. Maybe on the negative side, the hostility, the withdrawal, the isolation that Dr. HT spoke about. And all of that affects relationship quality and relationship stability. As clinicians, we also look at what might be occurring in their mental health that would affect those connections. So then we found ourselves in a state of ambiguity as clinicians. One of the things that affected me most was using the Zoom platform or teleconferencing platform to do sessions or group work where we depend so much on reading body language and making eye contact. And that was very difficult over a teleconferencing platform. So we had to learn how to, one of the tricks that I used was I would look at the camera and I would say, okay, this is what it looks like when it appears that I'm looking at you in your eyes, making eye contact. And then I would look at them to see them. And I said, but this is actually me looking into your eyes, so that they could see where my eyes were on the screen. And they would understand that just because it didn't look like I was looking at them, they knew that I was looking at them. They were able to adjust cognitively to that little change. Then it became a mask, no mask conversation, vaccine, no vaccine conversation. And that's where I feel like we are still right now with the pandemic coming back into potential, what do they call the new strain, the Delta strain. There's a fear of us going back into this isolation. So the question is, we're on this roller coaster. When do we give up on reaching out? When do we give up on, Dr. Herman Turner mentioned that it's like having a series of bad relationships And then you start to ask yourself, why do you even bother? Why even keep dating? It kind of feels like that. So on that note, where do we go from here? So I'll turn it over to Zach.
Yeah. So the question of why connect is what it sounds like we're getting to. It's been a really stressful relational period. And there almost seems to be a question of, should I connect? And not only with the people in my life, but with our clients, practitioners, and get to meet people. The question of the degree to which we should connect or might connect with clients when we're not even really connecting that well often. So we seem to get this question of, to what degree should we connect? There's an idea that the individual is within their own body, that the mind resides within my brain. So that the mind is what the brain does is what we've kind of gone for quite some time, which provides this sense that I get to choose as an autonomous individual who I connect with and how I connect. Thankfully, we've had a ton of new research come out in the field of neuroscience, particularly in the field of interpersonal neurobiology in the last 20 to 30 years. And a key new aspect of the mind is that it is both embodied and relational. So we now know that I have a little bit of a brain around my gut, a little bit of a brain around my heart, and then a brain inside my skull. So do each of you. And there is a flow of energy and information exchange that occurs within my own embodied brain and your embodied brains. And so the aspect is both within me, within you, and between us that make up a mind.
Questions that you said, interpersonal
Neurobiology. Yeah, and if you just check the slides, Dan Siegel, who's I'm citing in most of this, is kind of the founder of that field. So it's kind of a trick question. We don't get to choose to connect or not to connect. We are more connected than we used to think that we are. We are not as autonomous as we would like to believe. There is an exchange of energy and information that is flowing between us, whether we like it or not. RCT capitalizes on this, knows the neuroscience, and says we know that there is an energy and information exchange happening, not just between people that you walk around, but particularly between the clinician and client, IAD. And so that if we focus on this, we know it exists, whether we like it or not, we might as well make it a vehicle for change. And not just might as well make it, but it is perhaps one of the most potent vehicles for change, is the energy and information flow that exists between the clinician and the client. They also comment strongly on the fact that both people grow. So this idea of it being mutual is a really important aspect of RCT, which was not always an aspect of counseling, definitely not traditional counseling. So we know that this connection exists, whether we like it or not. We can capitalize it and use it as a vehicle for change. And connection in and of itself is not necessarily healthy or beneficial, right? Many people are coming to us for counseling because they've been connected with in ways that are harmful, traumatic, painful. So the question then becomes, you can go to the next slide, what is the best space to connect with our clients from? From what space? What kind of connection? What sounds like a simple answer is the self space. I chose this self-portrait from Pablo Picasso of himself to give us a little bit of a picture of a lot of these concepts sound simple, and thankfully we have the academic mind to parse out what these words mean and understand that I can say, be authentic, Dr. HT, be authentic, Christy, come from your self space. And in no way is that simple. In no way is that simple to even understand that there is a self to come from and what it means to come from itself. Thankfully, next slide, we've had a lot of people flesh out this idea of what is the self. So Carl Rogers, Virginia Satir, Richard Schwartz, who came up with internal family systems, have all spoken to this quality of what I would call the self. So Carl Rogers believing that there's a kernel within every human that if we can remove the obstacles, we'll grow, we'll move toward actualization, whether we think it would or not, it does. Virginia Satir believes that everyone has this life force energy that if they can connect with, will lead to healing. It's a paramount aspect of her theory. Richard Schwartz, same thing, calls it the capital S self and says, beyond being a peaceful state from which to witness and transcend the world, this mindful state of self was also healing, creative, and performance enhancing. When my clients entered the self state, they didn't just witness their parts passively, they began to interact with them creatively, which seemed to heal them. And there's this beautiful story of Richard Schwartz coming up with internal family systems and believing along the route that he would need to teach one of the parts of self to lead and facilitate the healing of kind of the other parts. And he was nervous because he felt like that was going to take a ton of energy to teach a part of self to lead the other parts. And what he found after working with thousands of clients is that everybody had this innate self that they could come to, that when they were in that self space was creative, spontaneous, healing, courageous, had clarity of mind, calm presence, and was able to work with the parts of self and heal it. So what I want to pay attention to here is we come from this idea of like, be yourself, be authentic. One, that was not always an idea that we had, right? If you look at the Freudian idea of self, it's a conscious and unconscious self, but it's not integrated. And this idea that the self not only exists, which is wonderful, a miracle that there is a self space, but also that it's all of these positive qualities, that when we come from the self space, which is inborn and does not need to be developed within any person, incredible, is clear, conscious, spontaneous, healing, etc. So if we go to the next slide, the 5 good things represent quite a bit of the research that comes from this idea of the self. So those qualities of self that all of these other kind of founders of theories have found are where we get a lot of these qualities of the 5 good things. The zest, sense of self-worth, clarity of self and others, increased productivity, and desire for deeper connection, which are all hallmarks of growth fostering relationships, come from the same qualities that we find in self. Yeah, the next slide. So we also know that the idea of coming from the self space as a therapist is not totally a new idea, right? Carl Rogers, Virginia Satir, and Charles Schwartz, again, all noticed that their best work occurred when they came from the same space that they were hoping their clients would get to. So Carl Rogers coming from his own humanness, Virginia Satir connecting to her own life force energy to reach out to clients. Charles Schwartz noting that when he came from his own self space, the parts in the other person felt more at ease and they were able to slide into their self space much more readily. And so just what happens to be true is that coming from the self space is inherently good for the client in order for them to enter their self space. What RCT does is say, we know. And so they've kind of taken this idea and said, isn't it wonderful? Let's focus on this and note that what is best for the client can actually be and should be best for the therapist. So when I am in my self space, it is good for me. It is naturally healing and connective and good for me, which is also good for the interactions I have with my client and pulls them toward a space that is naturally healing from them in their self space, which is also beneficial to me. So both of us are mutually pulled towards self space and mutually benefited, healed. It is good for us when we connect in that space. So we're both impacted and we both get pulled toward the self space. Can we go to the next slide? We're not going to get into this because it's too long for today. But at another time, or if anyone has questions in Zoom, I would love to talk about the quantum aspects of the self. And kind of the more that we know, the more that we realize that the self is a state of mind and mind is an emergent property of energy, we look to the quantum realm to understand the mind and self, which also means that if we want to practice being in self, we need to look to the theories of quantum physics and quantum reality.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm a little familiar with quantum physics
Yeah.
too. And just briefly mention what you mean by quantum physics.
For sure. So if we're looking at this graph, the plane of existence on the bottom is the space of all probability. So there is no form and nothing has been actualized. There's not even technically energy. So it's technically what Arthur Zime would call the quantum field. From that space, all energy arises and moves toward full actualization, which would look like the points at the top. So a word I've spoken, a thought I've had, an emotion has been embodied is the fully actualized energy. Energy is that flow from the field, the quantum field, to the point. So what we know from studying being itself is that the qualities that come from the self look very similar to the qualities that come from participating in that field and less like participating in the peaks of thought and emotion. And so that when we practice what we're going to do next, which is a meditation exercise, when we practice accessing the space of that field, we also get practice in being in the other aspect of the self. So the self has this quantum aspect of being the plane, universal, completely connected, but also this clarity, zeal, courageous interaction, and that it is both of those things. So when we practice the underside of being in that field, we also somehow get more access to the other aspect of the quantum self. For sure. So the next slide is, this is also all from, these parts are from Dan Siegel. He's come up with this practice called the Wheel of Awareness. And what it does is it helps us get into contact with that space of more probability, which we also know in working with clients is a really healing idea that often we're stuck in repetitive, harmful patterns that keep us out of connection. We run away when we really need to be connected. And so these activities help us to see more opportunity, more chances, more probability in terms of what we might do next. So the point of doing this next experience is to remind us, one, that there is a self, and then two, that again, it's not easy to connect to that self space. It's not a given that we're coming from self. And particularly after 2 years of being quite isolated, and getting back into in-person conferences, kind of in-person therapy with clients, still hybrid right now. We almost need to be really sure that we are practicing coming from self and being in self, particularly if we know through RCT that it deeply impacts the space that our clients are into. And so what I'd like to do is just do this 7-ish minute practice that kind of reminds us how good it can feel to come from a self space. So what I'd love for you to do is, Dr. T, do you mind sitting over there so that we're a little more you're good right there. This won't take too much of your time, but I think it's really important. And I dare you to give me your attention for 7 minutes and to give yourself the attention to pay attention to yourself. And so if you're comfortable, I'd invite you to close your eyes. Put both of your feet on the floor to ground yourself. And to begin just paying attention to your breath. Let your breath fill your awareness. Just ride your breath in and out of your body. Maybe your breath is at your nostril level. Maybe it's at your chest, your abdomen. Focus your attention. Let your breath fill your awareness. Now imagine sending a spoke out of the center of your awareness, an arrow out of your awareness toward your ears, and the aspect of hearing. And let sound fill your awareness. Next, send that arrow to your sense of sight. So just notice through your eyelids, any colors, sensations. Let your sight fill your awareness. Next, send that arrow of attention and awareness to your sense of smell to the nostrils. Take a deep breath. Let smell, sense of smell, fill your awareness. You smell in the air. We'll move that arrow of awareness to a sense of taste. Your tongue and your cheeks and your sense of taste fill your awareness. Last sense, direct your attention to touch. You rub a few of your fingers together. Feel your feet on the floor, back against the chair. Let the sensation of touch fill your awareness. Next, we'll move our awareness to the interior of the body. So start with your head and your scalp. Similar to a body scan, let your top of your head, internal, fill your sense of awareness. Bones in your skull and your face, down to the neck. The sinews in your shoulders, bones in your arms, to your wrist, palm, all the way out each finger. We can go down from our neck, down our back, to our hips, bones and fat in our legs and thighs, knees, all the way down to our ankles, feet. Staying with the interior of the body, let your hips fill your awareness again. Focus on the abdomen. So let the sensation of the interior of your abdomen, your gut, intestines, bring your attention. Move up to the lungs. Draw your attention to the interior of the lungs. Lastly, to your heart space, just left of center. Bring your awareness to your heart. Next, we'll let our mental life fill our awareness. So first, let any thought, memory, belief, picture, emotion come into your mind. Let your mental life fill your awareness. Give it your attention. Now I want you to pay a little more attention. So notice, how does a thought, an idea, or a picture come into your mind? What does it look like when it comes there? What does it feel like or look like when it stays? And then how does it go? Is it replaced immediately by another idea or thought? Is there a space between ideas and thoughts? Just study the process of your mental life. What does it look and feel like? Give it your attention and your words. I invite you to let those thoughts go. Take a deeper breath. Another deep breath. Now we'll turn our awareness to our sense of connection. Science now shows us how connected we are. Begin by putting your awareness on the connection you have to those you love most. Feel how strong you are connected to your family and your loved ones. Let that sense of connection fill your awareness. See if you can expand that sense of connection to not just your family and loved ones, but your friends. Expand the feeling of connectedness to maybe your colleagues, and your students. See if you can hold more connection by expanding the sense of connection to people, maybe even in the whole city. Perhaps your whole state. Awareness of connection to everyone in the United States. Bring your awareness, the sense that you're connected to every human being that exists. Lastly, increase that sense of connection or connection to every living organism. The planet itself, we are. We know that sending compassion and love actually does impact the space around us. So can you send out through that connection thoughts and feelings, passion and love? Now can you send those same thoughts to yourself? Same thoughts you are sending out. You are part of the connection. You can send them. Take a deeper breath. This last step of the practice. Send that arrow of awareness out of ourselves. Let it fold back in on itself, back into where it came. Letting our sense of awareness fill our awareness. The fact that we can be aware. Awareness of our awareness. You spend some time resting in that space. You can begin to gently open your eyes. You might have an immediate thought or feeling. We get into the last portion. Was it hard to connect to something? Was it hard to stay present? What was it like being aware of awareness?
Once the connection expanding. It almost surpassed my expectations of connecting. It stretched my mind to really
There was a blockage in connecting those in some of the closer circles, which inhibited me moving past into that nurture connection until my spiritual connection entered that I wasn't even thinking. It was like it made it come full circle. I could feel that connection, not as strong as I would like it to be because it's spirit of me. But it intensified when you said to connect with living organisms and the earth. I felt a groundedness that was stronger.
I enjoyed the grounded center of the experience. It's moving through those levels. The same thing about experiencing. Experiencing where that connection extends in larger relationships. So,
One of the things also that was new that I've never noticed before, I've never given attention was when you talked about observing how the thoughts changed and ebbed and flowed in the mind. Mine doesn't go switch, it morphs. And I remember knowing that as a child, but it morphs into different images. It doesn't just like switch like a slideshow.
One of the aspects of the practices that we learn by doing it, that we have much more control over our destiny. And with that amount of control, we bring that into the session to choose to come from self-space rather than hope that it happens or work on it during the week. Just bring this practice and where our awareness rests, and which space we are bringing to the session.
I'm going to follow up with connecting us back to RCT a little bit. I think we've seen this beautiful experience of connecting and how the counselor, we as counselors are an element of that connection and our importance and our value, and building that microcosm in our sessions in order to create a place for connection. Usually as clinicians, we tend to focus on the other, but taking this opportunity to turn and look at the self in that equation as well. Some more concrete, taking us back to more concrete look at this, considerations, right? We know a lot of this reminders, creating a safe space that people are coming in with very different histories. We looked at Christy's history of the past couple of years. We all have our own history of how we've been impacted by disconnection, and making that choice to reconnect. So our experiences are different. Our past relational histories are different as well. Looking at the wounds caused by marginalization, discrimination, that expression of two-way empathy, the desire to engage in cooperative relationships. And I think at this point, in some ways, we're making a choice. Things are happening, but we're also making a choice and trying to stretch ourselves a little bit as our clients borrow of us too when they come to session. Some look at treatment goals, right? Building a growth fostering relationship, cultivating that empathy for self and others. As we work through transitions and reintegration, right? The fear that's experienced coming into session, but also maybe it's reentering the workforce. Maybe it's going back to work in a physical place. We've become really accustomed to work conversations. We can have the conversations that we know, but now we're being stretched to have conversations with strangers and to go beyond that, and working through that internalized anxiety in some ways. The ways that we've become familiar with relating are once again being changed and challenged. Looking at the empathy for self and other, feelings of mutuality, opening those things up, and then reducing isolation, right? And meeting a client where it's at, meeting ourselves where it's at. Looking at disconnection, right? So disconnections have happened, by choice, in a way of keeping us safe. We've probably experienced people who didn't want to be around us or wanted to be around us for grounded reasons, but still having an emotional response to those things. So providing a space, particularly for clients, to work through and have the conversations about the things that keep happening, that have been impactful, but because they've been a universal experience, in some ways, maybe we haven't seen the value of our own experiences in that equation. I know we are well over time. We have questions and references and our contact information, which we love to connect. We have really enjoyed these conversations, and we would like more of them, because that is one of the 5 good things.